A fisherman went out to sea to catch fish, but his nets didn't bring up any fish. Instead, he found a rusty diving suit that had been lying on the seabed for decades. He decided to open it, and what he found inside changed his life forever. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The first light of morning crept across the horizon, painting the line where water met sky in muted tones of gray and pale gold. The sea lay in its usual restless stillness, breathing in slow swells that lifted the small wooden boat as though it were a toy resting in the cradle of something ancient and immeasurable. The air carried its familiar burden, the scent of salt, fish, and damp wood. The old nets piled in the stern released their own sour tang, reminders of years spent in repair and use, patched more often than they were ever replaced. To the man who stood within that boat, bare arms already slick with the cool dew of morning, these were not mere sensations. They were his companions, as much a part of him as his scarred hands, or the lines etched deep across his face. He moved without hurry, yet with a rhythm that spoke of a life entirely consumed by repetition. Every gesture was an echo of yesterday, of the day before, of decades in which the sea had been both master and provider. His father had taught him this craft, guiding his small hands across ropes, showing him how to read the water's subtle shifts. That father had vanished into a storm, never to return, swallowed by the same force he had worshipped. The boy left behind had grown into this man, hardened by toil, shaped by absence, bound to the sea by something more than duty. It was inheritance, curse, and solace all bound together. His shack on the shore was little more than a skeleton of wood, patched and leaning with age, but it was his alone now. The laughter of his wife had long since faded into memory, carried away by sickness. The footsteps of his son no longer echoed across the dirt floors. The young man had gone inland, lured by the promises of the city, of wages not bound to weather and tide. Letters came less and less until they ceased altogether. In the emptiness of his days, the fisherman came to know silence as his truest companion. Silence and the unyielding voice of the sea. This morning, as he pushed his oars into the water and let the current carry him beyond the reach of the harbor, there was nothing to suggest that the day would be different from countless others. The gulls screamed their hungry protests, circling lazily overhead. The sails shuddered and filled with the faint wind that crept in from the east. He cast his nets with a practiced flick of his arm, letting the ropes hiss and coil through his hands before splashing into the depths. The water swallowed them without comment, as it always did. For a time he simply sat, breathing deeply, watching the surface shift in slow ripples. His thoughts strayed to his empty cupboards, to the bread he would need to buy, to the quiet he would return to. Yet beneath that rhythm of routine, an unease stirred. It was not unusual. Every fisherman knew the anxiety of the day's gamble. Sometimes the sea provided. More often it withheld. But today the stillness pressed heavier than usual, as if something below waited in patience, hiding in the dark folds of water. He shook off the thought and took a swallow from his flask, the metal tang of warm water coating his tongue. The rope twitched faintly in his palm, and he leaned forward, expecting the familiar thrash of fish tangled within the mesh. Instead, the weight that answered him was strange. It did not fight. It did not move. It clung to the deep with a resistance that felt deliberate, almost resentful. His arms strained as he pulled, his shoulders tightening with the memory of long years of hauling. Yet the thing at the other end did not yield easily. The boat shifted, boards creaking as the weight dragged against one side. He muttered under his breath, convinced for a moment that his net had snagged on a rock or some forgotten wreck. He braced his feet against the slick planks and heaved again, sweat already forming along his brow despite the cool breath of morning. Bit by bit, the resistance relented. A shadow rose from beneath the surface, at first nothing more than a darker patch within the swell. He squinted against the light, straining to discern its shape. The gulls wheeled higher, their cries turning sharper, more insistent, as though they too recognized something unnatural in the water. The fisherman's heart pounded harder, echoing in rhythm with the rope's tautness. He told himself it was driftwood, or perhaps a barrel long lost from some trading vessel. Yet, as the shape thickened, becoming more defined, the certainty of that explanation unraveled within him. What broke the surface at last was not wood, nor a crate, nor even the skeletal remains of some ship. It was a figure, a human figure. Water poured from it in heavy streams as the net dragged it across the surface, and for a moment he thought his eyes deceived him. The broad bulk of the body was clad in something that gleamed dully beneath the sheen of morning light. A heavy suit, thick with the weight of metal and fabric long decayed. The head was encased in a rounded helmet, its glass front cracked into jagged lines, the whole of it covered in algae and barnacles. He froze, rope burning against his palms. His breath caught in his throat as the truth pressed upon him. He had not brought up debris. He had brought up a man, or what was left of one. The figure dangled awkwardly in the net, limbs stiff, the grotesque mockery of life suspended in silence. For a long moment he could not move. The sea itself seemed to pause, as though watching with him, waiting for his reaction. At last, instinct overcame paralysis. He pulled again, muscles trembling with effort, until the weight of the figure thudded against the side of the boat. The impact nearly capsized him, and he scrambled to steady himself, cursing under his breath, though his voice shook. With careful maneuvering, he managed to drag the body aboard. It landed on the deck with a hollow metallic crash, the sound of the helmet striking wood reverberating through the planks and into his bones. The fisherman stood over it, chest heaving, his eyes wide. Never in his life had he witnessed such a sight. He had heard tales, of course, old men in the harbor speaking of bodies washed ashore, of skeletons pulled from nets, of the sea returning what it had claimed. But this was different. This was not a bleached corpse or a broken remnant. This was a man encased in armor, a relic from another time, preserved by the deep like some ghastly treasure. The helmet's cracked glass reflected a sliver of the rising sun, casting a warped glimmer across the deck. He felt suddenly as though he were being watched, though the face inside was obscured, shrouded by darkness and the grime of years underwater. He dared not kneel closer. His throat tightened, his hands trembling despite the cold calm that had returned to the sea. All around him the world continued its indifference. The gulls screamed, the water lapped, the boat rocked in its ceaseless rhythm. Yet for him, everything had changed. The ordinariness of his day had shattered with the sound of that helmet striking wood. What lay before him was no mere catch. It was a secret, sealed by time, thrust upon him by the sea. He did not yet know what it meant, or what he would do. But he knew this. Nothing that followed would be ordinary again. The sea had chosen him for something, and its gift, or its curse, lay sprawled at his feet in the form of a drowned man armored in rust and silence. The figure lay heavy on the deck, its bulk shifting slightly with the roll of the boat, water still trickling from seams in the suit and pooling darkly across the planks. The fisherman stood frozen, hands hanging uselessly at his sides, his breath shallow, his gaze locked on the grotesque prize the sea had forced upon him. For several long moments he did not move. He could not. It was as though by bringing this thing aboard, he had altered the very balance of the world. The routine that had governed every morning of his life was broken. No amount of salt spray or wind would wash it away. The sea had returned something that was never meant to rise again. Cautiously, he stepped closer. His boots echoed against the wood, the sound too loud in the heavy silence that pressed around him. The gulls, which had wheeled and shrieked so greedily before, now circled at a distance, their cries fewer, sharper, almost reluctant. He crouched low, extending a hand but stopping short of touching the figure. The suit was encrusted with layers of barnacles and sea moss, but beneath the growth it was clear that this was no common clothing. It was armor of a kind, thick fabric reinforced with metal, fashioned for a world alien to his own, the dark underbelly of the sea where ordinary men did not tread. The helmet drew his attention most of all. A rounded dome of tarnished copper or bronze, its once bright surface now dulled by rust and the patient work of salt water. Across the faceplate, a crack spread like a lightning bolt frozen in glass. Behind it, only shadow. He could not see features, only a vague suggestion of hollows where eyes should be. He shivered and looked away, but the impression of a gaze lingered, as though something unseen stared back through the fractured lens. His fingers brushed at the edge of the helmet, and a flake of rust came away, staining his fingertips with red dust. The chill of the metal seeped into his skin. It was a cold deeper than that of water or morning air. He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping it against his trousers, as though he had touched something foul. His breath rasped in his throat, and he muttered under his breath, though even his own voice sounded foreign, unwelcome. Gathering what little resolve remained, he shifted his attention to the rest of the body. The suit, though battered, had preserved much of its form. Thick seams ran along the arms and legs, seams now swollen with decay, but still stubbornly intact. At the waist, a belt remained fastened, though corroded. Attached to it was a small, heavy-looking container, square in shape, its sides scarred with rust. A clasp, also eaten by time, held it closed. The fisherman's eyes fixed on it, heart tightening. Containers at sea meant secrets. Smugglers tied them to anchors. Sailors threw them overboard when inspection loomed. What this one had carried into the depths and preserved through decades or more, he could not begin to imagine. He leaned closer, his breath fogging faintly against the chilled metal. On the side of the helmet, beneath a layer of barnacles, he noticed faint marks. At first he thought them scratches, random scars of corrosion. But as he scraped lightly with the edge of his knife, lines began to take shape. Letters. Numbers. Half-eaten by rust, yet still legible in fragments. An L, followed by something that might have been a 0 or a 9. More symbols followed, incomplete, vanishing into the decay. His stomach clenched. These were no accidents of nature. Someone had marked this helmet, catalogued it, given it identity. He sat back on his heels, knife trembling in his grip. He could no longer tell himself this was merely the sea's trick, some relic thrown aside. This had belonged to a man, once named, once counted, now reduced to a hollow echo preserved by salt and silence. His eyes moved again to the container at the belt. He imagined it filled with maps, documents, perhaps even treasure, or perhaps nothing but stone, a weight to pull a body down into oblivion. Yet the presence of it, sealed and stubborn, whispered of purpose. His heart thudded in his chest as he reached toward it. The clasp resisted at first, stiff with rust, but his fingers found a corner and pulled. The container rattled faintly, a hollow metallic sound that jolted through him. He froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. That noise, it had not come from his hands. It had come from within. Something inside had shifted, disturbed by his movement, alive with presence, even if lifeless in truth. He snatched his hand back, clutching it against his chest, as if he had burned himself. For a long moment he sat in silence, the only sound the faint lapping of water against the boat's hull. Yet beneath that quiet, he swore he heard something else, a faint scrape, so soft he might have imagined it, as though fingernails dragged lightly against the inside of the helmet's glass. His breath quickened, eyes snapping to the cracked faceplate. Shadows stared back. Only shadows? And yet his mind insisted he had not been mistaken. Something had stirred. He staggered to his feet, backing toward the mast, his body trembling. His gaze remained locked on the figure sprawled across the deck. The sun had risen higher now, casting light that shimmered across the water. But the brightness did nothing to warm him. The air felt thick, pressing down against his lungs, heavy with a tension that had not existed before he pulled that net from the sea. Even the gulls had gone quiet, hovering far above as though unwilling to come closer. His thoughts spiraled. He remembered stories told in hushed voices by men at the harbor, tales he had laughed at as a boy and dismissed as drunken fancy in his youth. Bodies pulled from nets, yes, but also stranger things. Men in suits of brass, helmets filled with bones, relics of wars long forgotten, sealed coffins tossed into the sea to hide crimes. The sea, they said, did not forget. It only waited. Now, as he stared at the drowned man at his feet, he knew those tales had not been born from fancy. They had been warnings. He circled the figure cautiously, steps slow and measured, as though it might rise at any moment. Each angle revealed something new. Along the arm, a strip of fabric still clung stubbornly, a faded color impossible to name. The boots were weighted, designed to anchor the wearer to the sea floor. Their soles clinked faintly against the wood, a hollow sound that reverberated too deeply. And everywhere, signs of human intent, craftsmanship, design, purpose, mocked by the ravages of time. He found himself whispering a prayer, though to what God he could not say. He had never been a man of faith, but in that moment he needed words to fill the silence, to push back against the weight of dread that thickened with every passing breath. His voice faltered and died quickly, leaving only the creak of the boat. He was alone with this thing, this relic, this body that seemed more present than any living soul. The fisherman rubbed his temples, trying to drive away the fog of fear clouding his thoughts. Yet his eyes returned again and again to the container, to the key that hung from a chain tangled near the figure's chest. Small, unassuming, it gleamed faintly beneath the grime, as though it had resisted the sea's corrosion better than the rest. A key meant a lock meant something worth hiding. And though every instinct screamed at him to cut the net, to heave the figure back into the water and let it vanish once more, he knew he would not. He could not. The sea had given him this, and the burden of its secret now sat heavy upon his shoulders. The boat rocked gently, carried by the rhythm of the tide. The sky had brightened, but its blue seemed pale, drained, as if the world itself recoiled from what had been revealed. The fisherman lowered himself slowly to sit against the mast, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes never leaving the figure sprawled across the deck. He had caught many things in his life, fish and driftwood, barrels and ropes, even the occasional treasure of little worth. But never this. Never something that pulsed with the presence of another life long extinguished. The helmet gleamed faintly, reflecting the sunlight in broken shards across the deck. The crack across its face resembled a wound, raw and jagged. He thought again of the sound he had heard, that faint scrape. He told himself it was nothing but water shifting, rust grinding, the imagination of a man too long alone with silence. But doubt gnawed at him, relentless, whispering that perhaps the sea had not given him a corpse at all, but something else, something less easily defined. He closed his eyes briefly, but the darkness behind them was worse than the sight before him. He saw shadows moving within the helmet, hands clawing at the inside of the container, a faceless figure rising to stand above him. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The body lay still, and yet the fear remained, a weight heavier than the sea itself, pressing against his chest. The fisherman drew his knees closer, arms wrapped around himself. He did not know what the day would bring, nor what choice he would make. But he knew this: he could not return to shore unchanged. The figure at his feet had torn open a seam in his life, just as its helmet bore that jagged crack. Through it, darkness leaked into the light of morning, and no net, no rope, no silence of the sea could mend it again. The fisherman remained seated against the mast for a long time, his eyes fixed upon the lifeless figure sprawled across his deck. The sea had quieted as though complicit, each ripple against the hull a soft murmur that only deepened the silence pressing upon him. His nets lay forgotten, the morning sun now high enough to paint the waves in pale gold, but he could not think of fish or trade, nor of the simple bread and oil he had hoped to buy that day. His mind was caught in the iron grip of the presence at his feet, the armored corpse that seemed to stretch its shadow over every corner of his small boat. He tried to steady his breathing, telling himself he was only a man with an unfortunate catch, nothing more. But as the hours bled into each other, the stillness of the figure began to feel less like death and more like a waiting. The helmet, cracked and obscured though it was, seemed to hold a darkness that was not empty. He could not shake the thought of eyes watching him from behind that fractured glass, eyes long dead, yet unwilling to release their claim. The sea itself felt changed, less a companion and more a conspirator, as though it had delivered not bounty but burden, and now watched to see what he would do with it. Old stories whispered at the back of his mind, tales he had heard since childhood. As a boy, he had laughed when the elders spoke of strange things dredged from the depths, barrels filled with bones, crates of forbidden cargo, helmets containing nothing but skulls. But now, as he gazed upon the armored figure before him, those tales no longer seemed like exaggeration. They seemed like warnings he had failed to heed. He remembered one story in particular, of a crew of divers who had vanished without a trace when searching for a wreck believed to carry contraband. No ship had ever returned. No bodies had washed ashore. Only silence followed, a silence that stretched through the years until the story became little more than a myth told in hushed tones in the taverns along the harbor. Yet what lay upon his deck seemed proof that such stories had roots deeper than imagination. The fisherman rose slowly, his body stiff from hours of tension, and began to pace the narrow length of the boat. His gaze returned again and again to the container strapped to the figure's waist, to the faint gleam of the key dangling from a corroded chain near its chest. Curiosity gnawed at him, a relentless hunger he could not quell. He imagined what the container might hold: maps leading to hidden treasure, documents of long-lost voyages, jewels or gold that could lift him out of poverty and rebuild the life he had lost. The thought of it was intoxicating. For years he had lived in meager silence, surviving day by day on the whims of the sea. What if, by some cruel twist of fate, the sea had chosen him to inherit something greater? Yet fear pressed back against that temptation with equal force. What if the container held poison, some chemical long discarded, still potent enough to kill with a single breath? What if it was not treasure, but evidence of crime, sealed away to prevent discovery, carrying with it not wealth, but danger? He thought of smugglers who tied their secrets to iron weights and let the sea guard them, secrets not meant for daylight. To bring such a thing ashore could be a curse, drawing suspicion, punishment, or worse. His pacing slowed, and he found himself staring once more at the helmet. The cracked glass revealed only shadow, yet he could not shake the sensation of being observed. It was as though the figure had not come aboard as a passive relic, but as a witness, waiting for him to act. He imagined, absurdly but vividly, that the drowned man still had a voice, silent but insistent, urging him toward the container, demanding that its secret be revealed. He clenched his fists, willing himself to look away, but the thought took hold like a hook in his flesh. The hours passed with torturous slowness. The fisherman tried to busy himself with small tasks, tightening ropes, adjusting the sail, checking his nets, but every motion circled back to the same truth. He could not leave the figure untouched. He could not cut it loose and let it sink back into the sea, for he would never be free of the knowledge that he had walked away from something the sea had chosen to return. Nor could he yet bring himself to pry open the container, to expose himself to whatever lay inside. He was trapped between fear and desire, suspended in a torment that seemed to stretch with the very horizon. He remembered his wife then, her laughter, her gentle chiding when he returned late with empty nets. She had believed the sea to be a fickle god, demanding respect, but also offering gifts when it willed. What would she say now if she saw him crouched over this armored corpse, trembling like a boy before a ghost? He imagined her urging caution, telling him to let the sea keep its secrets. Yet he also imagined the disappointment in her eyes, the reminder of their hunger, the years of struggle that might have been eased if only he had reached beyond fear. His thoughts drifted to his son, now lost to the city. The young man had left behind the rhythm of tides and nets, chasing work that promised steadier wages. Would he have opened the container without hesitation? Would he have mocked his father's trembling, called him a fool for hesitating before what might be salvation? The fisherman felt shame coil in his chest. Was he a coward for resisting, or wise for fearing? He could not tell. The line between prudence and weakness blurred until it vanished entirely. The sun began its descent, painting the sea in streaks of orange and crimson. The fisherman sat once more against the mast, his body weary, his mind consumed. He could not eat, could not drink. The figure dominated every thought, its presence heavier than the nets that had dragged it from the depths. He imagined what lay inside the container, each vision darker or brighter than the last. At times, he saw gold spilling across his deck. At others, he saw bones tumbling out, their hollow sockets staring at him in eternal accusation. He thought of poison seeping into the air, of curses whispered in languages forgotten. Each possibility terrified him, yet none of them drove him to cut the ropes and rid himself of the burden. By the time darkness gathered across the horizon, he knew the truth he had resisted all day. He would not let it go. He could not. The sea had placed this secret into his hands, and his life had already been altered by its presence. To return, it would not erase what he had seen, nor silence the questions that now clawed at his mind. He would never sleep again without knowing. The temptation had grown too strong, entwined with his very breath. Yet still the fear remained. It crouched in his chest like a living thing, whispering that what he sought might consume him entirely. He sat in the fading light, the helmet gleaming faintly in the glow of the dying sun, and felt the weight of decision pressing down upon him. He did not yet move, but the path was already chosen. He would not abandon this secret to the sea. He would open it, and whatever horror or salvation waited inside, it would be his alone to bear. The gulls returned then, their cries sharp and discordant against the quiet sea, as if mocking his choice. He raised his eyes to them, lips pressed tight, and whispered nothing. His silence was answer enough. Night had fallen by the time the fisherman stirred from the heavy stillness that had consumed him. He had sat through the long hours of dusk, watching the sky bleed from crimson into violet, and then into the deep shadow of stars. The figure on the deck had not moved, not so much as shifted with the sway of the boat, yet its presence remained suffocating, filling every corner of his mind. He had told himself he would wait until morning, that in the safety of daylight he might find the courage to do what he could not yet bring himself to attempt. But he knew the truth. He would not sleep. Not with that container glinting faintly at the figure's waist, not with the key dangling like a promise he could not ignore. The sea had delivered him into this moment, and now it pressed upon him with a weight heavier than any net he had ever hauled. He rose unsteadily, his legs stiff, his body trembling from fatigue, and crossed the small deck. The lantern he carried cast a dim yellow glow that seemed too weak to fight the shadows clinging to the armored corpse. He crouched beside it, his breath rasping in his throat, and stared at the rusted container once more. His fingers hovered above the clasp, hesitating, before moving instead to the key tangled against the chest of the suit. The chain was corroded, but with effort he pried it loose, the small piece of metal coming away with a faint snap. It lay cold and heavy in his palm, a token of intention, of inevitability. He turned the key in the clasp. At first it resisted, stubbornly bound by time and rust, but with a final twist, it yielded, breaking free with a sound that made him flinch as though the dead man had groaned. The container rattled faintly in his hands as he pulled it free from the belt. He set it on the deck and lifted the lid. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, his own reflection trembling in the faint gleam of rust. Then the contents revealed themselves, and his breath caught. Inside lay a bundle of objects, preserved against the sea's decay more than he had dared hope. Maps, their edges swollen with damp, but still legible. Lines marked with routes that stretched into waters far beyond his own. A packet of papers, written in a language not entirely familiar, the ink smudged and blurred but clear enough to suggest official records. And at the bottom, wrapped tightly in cloth, a small wooden box. His hand shook as he reached for it. The box creaked as he pried it open. Within, coins gleamed faintly, their golden surfaces dulled but unmistakable even in the lantern light. Wealth, proof, evidence. He stared at the contents, his mind spiraling. Treasure of a kind, enough perhaps to change everything he had ever known. With these coins, he might repair his home, bring his son back, purchase a life free from the cruel mercy of the sea. Yet even as his heart surged with the possibility, his stomach clenched. These were not gifts left for him. They were relics of something darker, something foul. The maps, the documents, the way the body had been discarded into the deep. It spoke not of fortune freely abandoned, but of crime, of betrayal, of a man drowned not by accident, but by design. He shifted his gaze to the helmet. The cracked glass caught the lantern's glow, casting a fractured light across the deck. The shadows within seemed to pulse, and again he felt that dreadful sensation of being watched. His breath quickened, a cold sweat sliding down his temple. He imagined the drowned man demanding justice, not treasure. The maps, the gold, the documents. They were evidence of a life taken, of greed and cruelty. To keep them would be to share in that crime, to inherit not salvation, but damnation. He dropped the coins back into the box, the clatter echoing through the stillness like bones striking stone. The sound made him flinch, but he did not look away. He forced himself to meet the darkness behind the broken faceplate. "What do you want of me?" he whispered, though no words answered, only the groan of the hull shifting against the tide. Yet in that silence, he felt the weight of expectation settle upon him. He was not meant to hoard what the sea had returned. He was meant to carry it into the light, to reveal what had been hidden, no matter the cost. The hours stretched into the slow approach of dawn, and the fisherman knew his decision had already been made. He would not cast the body back into the depths. He would not pocket the gold and tell himself the sea had chosen to reward him. He would bring the corpse, the maps, the documents ashore. He would deliver them into the hands of others, and in doing so, he would surrender himself to whatever judgment followed. It might bring him ruin. It might bring him nothing at all. But he knew he could not continue as though the day before had not happened. His silence would be no different from complicity. The sky began to pale, streaks of pink and gray bleeding across the horizon. The sea mirrored the light, a glassy expanse that seemed too calm, too serene after the storm within his mind. He lashed the container shut, securing it near the mast, and turned to secure the figure itself, fastening ropes around the stiffened limbs and the heavy helmet to prevent it from shifting in the boat. As he worked, he tried not to think of the faint scrape he had heard the day before, the suggestion of movement behind the glass. He told himself, the dead do not move. He told himself he was merely weary, imagining things born of fear. But even as he repeated these assurances, he could not banish the certainty that the drowned man bore witness to every motion. By the time the sun rose, the fisherman had set his course toward shore. His hands gripped the tiller with white-knuckled force, his body aching from exhaustion, his mind hollow from the weight of his decision. The coastline lay far ahead, a thin dark line against the brightening sky. He knew that when he reached it, nothing would be the same. He would arrive not as a fisherman returning from an ordinary day at sea, but as a man carrying the secret of a crime buried by salt and time. The gulls returned, circling above his boat, their cries sharp and grating, as though proclaiming to the empty horizon the burden he bore. He did not curse them away as he might have on another day. He let them cry, let them herald what he carried. The sea had chosen him, and now it seemed the sky itself joined in announcing it. He fixed his gaze on the approaching land, his heart heavy but resolute. The boat moved steadily, each wave carrying it closer to the shore, closer to the moment when the silence of the drowned would be broken. He thought of his father, lost to a storm, and wondered if the old man too had once stumbled upon a truth too heavy to carry. He thought of his wife, who had always believed the sea gave only what was deserved, and he thought of his son, whose absence weighed as heavily as any treasure. Perhaps when the boy returned, he would know his father had not spent his life in silence. The horizon grew nearer. The fisherman wiped his brow, his face streaked with salt and sweat, and tightened his grip on the tiller. The sea stretched calm and endless behind him, indifferent once more, but he knew he had been changed forever. The drowned man lay bound at his feet, the container secured at the mast, and within them lay truths that could not be denied. He did not know what judgment awaited him, nor whether the world would thank or condemn him for bringing this burden ashore. But he knew one thing, with the certainty of tide and current. He could not return to the man he had been before. The sea had given him this secret, and he would bear it to its end. As the first cries of waking men reached from the coast, the fisherman sailed on, his boat heavy with silence, his heart heavier still. He had opened what was never meant to be opened, seen what was never meant to be seen. And though the world lay bright before him, he knew he would carry the darkness of that revelation until the end of his days. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And be sure to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.